So I'd like now to welcome our stalwart, Marrion, retired education psychologist, regional representative for the Association of Education Psychologists until 2020, and has worked in all school sectors and taught in non-grammar secondary schools for many years. She's also a very valued member of Reclaim the Enlightenment Committee for a number of years, and has been coordinator of this programme, as she feels strongly that we could have a better education system for all our children and for our society.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much everybody for coming along today and for staying and so on. I actually haven't very much left to say because all the other speakers have been so comprehensive in what they've said, but I'm going to go ahead with what I have got to say. I will say thanks very much again to the Association of Education Psychologists for supporting us at this conference particularly, and in 2016 the Association of Educational Psychologists had their annual conference here in Belfast at the at the Hilton. It was great crack, and at our AGM we passed almost unanimously a motion against selective education, rejecting selective education, which looked as if it was coming back into being across the water. But for that reason I think Kath has come over and supported us here today, and very much appreciate that. Could I also say that teaching unions locally and most of our politicians are in favour and were in favour of scrapping this idea of academic selection. However, there does remain a widespread belief, it's a myth, that our education system here is the best in the British Isles, and I meet people who are very, very good friends and very educated people, teachers, some of them, who believe this, and that's due to, as somebody has mentioned earlier, about the good results you get every August, the good O-level and A-level results from those that small percentage of our pupils who go to the selective grammar schools. So I'm sort of skipping bits because bits have been covered already, but at almost 13%, Northern Ireland has the largest proportion of pupils in the British Isles who leave school with basic or no qualifications. The proportion of young people here who are not in education, employment or training outstrips that in Britain. And adult literacy rates indicate that 1 in 5 adults here has very poor literacy skills. By that we mean reading age of about 7, is it? Well, that's what it is really. So almost half of the primary school pupils don't even take the transfer exam, and many are likely to have disengaged from an early age, often leading to generational disadvantage. People say, my father didn't take it, my mother didn't take the 11+, so there's no point in us going into it. And often those children are sitting in classes where peers are being prepared for the transfer exam, and so the teaching is directed towards those who are taking the exam, and their learning suffers. Now, because I'm trying to come at it from a psychological point of view, I was looking to see, well, what's the psychological research saying? And it was very disappointing. There is very little research done. However, we have this Professor Siobhan O'Neill, who's a mental health champion, and she had done some work with a recent survey with teachers. Almost 92% of teachers described the test as having a significant mental health impact. So if the teachers are saying having to do the transfer tests is having a significant mental health impact on their pupils. And when those pupils who fail arrive in non-grammar schools, where I did most of my teaching, you find that teachers speak about the need to rebuild pupils' self-confidence and self-esteem, because the potential for harm to their self-esteem and well-being is immense. And of course the tests discriminate against neurodiverse and disabled children. So I also want to quote from the Young Life and Times and also the Kids Life and Times survey. In general, I think we're hearing this all the time in the press, that our young people, our pupils, are experiencing a high level of stress with competition in school. And research has shown that the well-being of 11-year-olds here has declined to its lowest scoring level since 2016. Now, that's maybe not all down to the having to do the transfer exams, but I'm sure that contributes to those findings. I also want to try to, because I was doing this talk, was really trying to find out what is the psychological evidence, and there's a big gap really. But I contacted a Dr. Tara Porter, and she works in CAMS, that's Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services in England, and she teaches and writes about mental health in schools, and she has highlighted that children and young people are reporting how stressed and unhappy they are with their schoolwork and the pressure they're experiencing. She also quoted that data from the Children's Society as part of the Good Childhood report consistently shows a low and decreasing level of happiness with school. And Dr. Porter suggests in the context of increased competition such as for transfer, you would expect that to add to the level of unhappiness among children. Jim has already talked about Cyril Burt. We're ashamed to say he was an educational psychologist, highly regarded for years, but his work was discredited. But we know that it did lead to the establishment of the grammar school system in England and Wales, and the continuing grammar school system here. Now, there remain a few areas in England which continue to have academic selection, and that's probably useful because in as much as there are reports that compare how children are doing in grammar schools with how they're doing in comprehensive schools. And recent Ofsted, that's the inspection reports, show that the results of children in comprehensive schools are comparable to many grammar schools, and also to academies, which is another system in England. And a study reported in Educational Review quite recently there in August 2023 suggests that the best pupils do better by avoiding grammar schools. So in Northern Ireland, we're left with an almost universal selective transfer system. And again, I found a little piece of work about what do parents here think of the transfer process. Obviously, as Terry has said, parents, you want what's best for your children. So I want to discuss findings from a recent piece of work done by a local education psychologist, Dr. Claire Kidston. She did her thesis by interviewing a local group of transfer parents. That's parents whose children were doing the transfer. Now, the parents, I think they were mostly mothers, reported that their children had experienced chronic and debilitating distress throughout their final years of primary school. The parents felt highly conflicted because they knew their children were experiencing this stress, but they felt, we don't really have a choice. We want our children to go to the best school. We've got to go through with this. Most of the parents had actually paid, as many parents do, for private tuition, and they'd entered at that stage both sets of tests, undermining notions that the process is seen as fair and objective. By the way, the tests used are unlikely to be standardised and unreliable in identifying pupils who will do well with a competitive academic curriculum. There's a new test at the moment, and it's likely that 1 or 2 points could make a big difference in how you're going to do. The reports of intense psychological and somatic distress during and after the test suggest that academic selection is not a harmless process. However, because we don't have hard evidence about the psychological and emotional consequences for individual children, there's no kind of emphasis on changing the system. Parents don't really have to have the power to say, we're not going through for it. Now, it seems that parents, teachers and pupils are all negatively impacted by the transfer process here. Good parenting would dictate that parents should comply with the system, which is highly stressful for all concerned. In a few local areas, transfer does not involve testing. For example, there's Maghera, Ballycastle, Portadown. There are schools there, big schools there, where you don't need to set the transfer to get into the school. They're a comprehensive type school, and I've heard that experience is much more benign. But again, there's not really hard evidence to support that. I do know that somebody who works for one of the the curriculum advisory service if she was looking for exemplars of good work at primary school, would go to the schools in Mahara, because the children there are being taught the broad range of the subjects in the curriculum, rather than being forced to, where teachers are teaching to the test. I feel that parent power is going to be needed to change the system, and I feel that parents are going to need the information to know that if your child does go to the local school, as Angeline has said, that's going to be all right for them. But there will probably need to be more research to give parents that information. And I think the Education Psychology Service here, and maybe the AAP, could convene a working group to contribute to ongoing debates from a psychological perspective. All the arguments are pointing to the need for change, so if we're not going to have academic selection, what sort of system are we going to have? Well, I think in an ideal world, the system of using unofficial academic transfer should be stopped. That suits pupils, parents, teachers. There's no more stress and anxiety of testing. Parents free from the stress and expense of tutoring, which is quite a big measure for parents. Schools will be freed from the pressure to deliver, well, that's a good school, it has good 11+ results. A wider curriculum will be followed for all pupils, including those who are often labelled or perceived as failures early in the primary school years. With selection process gone, siblings and friends wouldn't be separated at 11, and the practice of excluding many pupils with special educational needs would end. I think pupils should transfer to the closest primary school. This could be a win for pupils, families, the environment, cutting down on the commute. Many could walk. There's several several rural towns. Well, I'm thinking of Crumlin and Randallstown and probably Larne and many others, where up to 20 buses leave the town every morning to drive past a local school which could accommodate them. And that practice is a vast expense to the budgets, to the environment, and to time spent travelling. Again, like the system that you mentioned, Angelina, and also the Dixon system in Portadown, at secondary level, after you've left primary school, if you go to a mixed ability, all ability classes in a junior high model, and then thereafter into more academic or vocational colleges from that Key Stage 4. And I think educational outcomes for all pupils would be raised, and we'll have a better educated and happier society. And now that's just looking at the transfer, not looking at the integrated education argument. So I have to say that we at Reclaim the Enlightenment are intending that this today is just a first step really in bringing all the information together, and we're going to talk about, we're not really, our budgets aren't tied to any particular agenda, so we're going to do our best to try and move the systems forward, following on from the examples of people who were quoted this morning from the Enlightenment who did bring about change, and hopefully we will too.